Mention your mentor even by name at this point until after we stopped recording. Okay, so or your mentee, sorry. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through just kind of some broad impacts of socialization, talk specifically about like the impact of COVID, talk specifically about the impact on older individuals, specifically the impact on the populations that you might be working with, and then we'll talk briefly how to combat it, and we'll have some kind of discussion themes throughout there. So just broadly, we are social creatures, right? We are designed to be around other people. We actually go crazy if you keep a person isolated for too long a period of time. We've seen that even, we obviously don't do those kinds of experiments with people because that would be super unethical, but we do see that with primates. When they're isolated from other primates for long enough, they go quite literally crazy. So there are some less extreme versions of what happens when someone's socially isolated. So emotionally, going to lead to things like anxiety, depression, certainly loneliness, but it can even be like lowered self-esteem and certainly a lowered sense of purpose. We get a lot of our identity from the people that we interact with, right? We get a lot of our purpose. Like I am a mother, I am a daughter, I'm a student. We take a lot of our identity from those things. And so when a lot of that's removed from us, we get kind of this sense of loss and the sense of kind of misdirection of like, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know who I am. And that can lead to a lot of negative feelings, as you can imagine. Interestingly, social isolation also impacts people physically. It can result in reduced cognitions like cognitive decline, reduced activity levels, leads to other health issues. So what was really interesting, I found a study prior to COVID that found that the lack of social connections heightens health risks as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I wouldn't have guessed that. I don't know about you guys, but like that sounds really extreme for me. And for social isolation to have as much of an impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day on someone's health is really significant. That same study found that like the loneliness that's caused from isolation is twice as harmful to physical and mental health as obesity. Again, not something that I would have expected. Obesity is an epidemic in our country, certainly, and knowing that loneliness can have worse consequences than obesity was really shocking for me to find out. I do want to point out there's a difference between occasional loneliness and chronic loneliness. So like we all experience loneliness, right? There's nobody to hang out with. We're feeling a little bit lonely, but we're talking about chronic loneliness. So like we've been in this pandemic for 2 years almost. We're talking about people who like week after week have very little interaction or have interactions that aren't of substance, right? Like you can be in a crowd and still feel lonely. Loneliness isn't defined as the physical lack of someone around, but it's that loss of feeling of connectedness, that identity that's not there anymore. Okay. Specifically, there was a study in central Indiana done recently that Jerry had sent to me. Found 1 in 3 adults are currently struggling with loneliness due to isolation. That's a lot. 1 out of 3 people is a huge amount, and that fewer than 1 in 5 are participating in community activities. So even though like the world's kind of started opening back up again, a lot of people are still hesitant to engage or have gone so long without engaging in stuff that like it feels weird to now. Or there's still like fears of COVID. I mean, like it's not gone. You know, depending on how at risk someone is, might be impacting whether or not they're even willing to start engaging again. So kind of ask a broad question here. Not everyone is at the same risk of being isolated, nor of it having a negative impact. What factors do you guys think would put someone at higher risk of being negatively impacted by loneliness?
They already have, some sort of mental health issues prior to being isolated. So previous depression, anxiety, or so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Any other ideas?
Drug addiction, alcohol addiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I saw some difficulties over the holidays, Christmas and New Year's.
Just like dealing with the holidays, like when we're around a holiday.
Well, I think New Year's was a trigger. So, and Christmas was difficult because, estranged from family, isolated from family.
Yeah, I definitely see that. Depending on the time of year, there's times where we expect to be like socially connected, and other times of the year that we're more okay with not being socially connected. Absolutely, yeah. Any other ideas?
Maybe the loss of a loved one, a death in the family or a friend.
Yeah, there's been more grief in this past 2 years than we've been used to, certainly as a nation. Yeah. Anybody else? Trust
me,
issues in the
I think
past.
I think it's if you live alone, because one of my coworkers at home, I was talking to her and she does live by herself, and something she said triggered me to think, oh, I need to check on her. So, she didn't have that routine of being with somebody, and she is an extrovert.
Yeah. Those are two things in there, right? Living alone, but also like personality type. Some people were isolating before and were totally fine with it. And some people were used to going out every night. Yes, absolutely.
And I also think not being able to worship like you're accustomed to, going to church or synagogue or wherever you go.
Yeah, people who had connections that aren't able to use them. Yeah. Yeah. You guys hit on most of them. So I think all of those are definitely going to have a stronger impact, right? This study in particular listed these following things. So I saw Jenny for trust issues. Yeah. So living in poverty is going to be one of the higher likelihood to have an impact, right? Or living in a high crime area, because like, I don't know about the rest of you guys, like when COVID started hitting, like I took my dog out like 3 times a day just to get out of my house. And if you're living in an area where you don't feel safe doing that, you're going to be more isolated. Having a disability means that things are already maybe harder to get around. And so now it's extra difficult, or if somebody is like immunocompromised, more worried about it. Living alone, anyone with language barriers. So anyone who happened to immigrate right before COVID hit, not a great time to be starting fresh in a new place. Right. All of these things predispose the individuals to smaller networks or to have less access. Okay. Another one is lacking family or lacking the means to visit family or have family visit. Right. Whether there's just a lack of family, or like families like stayed away and just can't get there. They can't get to them. Those things are going to make the risk of someone dealing with loneliness or isolation much higher. Specifically for our populations, what extra difficulties do you imagine someone who has been experiencing homelessness might be facing when it comes to socializing?
Will you repeat that question, Rachel?
Yeah, sorry. So what extra difficulties do you imagine someone who has been experiencing homelessness might be facing when it comes to socializing?
Well, I guess I'm picturing, some of the homeless camps, and, everybody in those cases are kind of close together. And with COVID, and the instructions to stay further apart, that's probably made it more difficult to socialize with other people on the streets.
Yeah.
And then maybe the organizations that normally would provide support, even socks and things like that, maybe they weren't available to hand those things out.
Yeah, bingo. Yeah, resources are so depleted right now. What else?
And I just saw on the news just a few minutes ago that down south, they're removing the tents or wherever the homeless people are living. So now they're even getting kicked out of the little area that they had to stay. So
Yeah, not even having somewhere to be. Can I see?
I make the observation that, I don't know about you, but I connected via Zoom with lots of people and like we're doing tonight. But if you don't have a smartphone or you have limited access, you really were limited because all mental health care went online. The technology limitations was a big gap.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and even if people who had access to it but didn't have a fast enough device, right? Like I know, like I was doing telehealth therapy, and the frustration of it lagging for 30 seconds, like really prevents that human connect. Even 3 seconds made it annoying, right? And got in the way, made people frustrated and not want to use it. Yeah, definitely. Any other ideas? I see Jenny wrote in the chat, bus passes and planning bus rides. Yeah, it became a lot hard. Even people who had the money for Uber, like if that were relying on it, like they stopped driving. So just simply getting around. Yeah. All right, second question. Same question, but with people who are re-entering the community. So what extra difficulties do you imagine someone who has recently re-entered the community from prison might be facing when it comes to socializing?
The stigma that people are looking at them like for what they've done. That's what my mentee is going through. She just feels like when somebody see her, they just see that she's been incarcerated. I'm like, they don't have no way of knowing that unless you tell them. But it's just in her mind.
I understand that in probation, they cannot, or it's a good idea for them not to associate with the people that they knew before who may have a bad influence and don't fall back into that. But those were the people you knew and you related to them. And you have to start over new and be in a, and it's, how do you strike up new friendships? I mean, it's a skill set, and obviously we weren't very socialized anyway, apparently, maybe. So I'm making an assumption that's bad.
That's okay.
But yes,
I mean,
just to-
I'm
just to
not
build
somebody
on-
that connects with a lot of huge group of people. You know, so I'm more of a one-on-one person. So yeah, I mean, how do you get in a social situation where you're talking to everybody and
Yeah, just to
Yeah,
build
no,
on
it's a
that.
great
I mean, again, we would hope that the people that we're mentoring that are coming out of the, or re-entering, would build new relationships, but those settings where they would normally do that, they've been canceled. I mean, just this coffee kind of brings to mind the mentor or the mentee recognition events we used to have where they, could meet other mentees and so forth. With the COVID, we just can't do those kind of things. And
Yeah, and all three of these things that Jenny, Byron, and Lynette all mentioned kind of play off of each other. You have people coming out who are supposed to be making new friendships, but there's a lack of ability to do that. And then there's a stigma, and even thinking about like normal conversation. What's one of the first things people ask new people? What do you do for a living? Right? What have you been up to for the past few years? What are your hobbies? And that fear of like, how do I respond to that? Do I tell people? Do I not tell people? Do I lie? But then I'm starting off this friendship on a lie, but I also, you know what I mean? Like there can be a lot of things that get in the way there that the rest of us don't have to think about when we're socializing. Right? Any other ideas? I think we hit on the main ones. It's just something to keep in mind that it's not as easy as just like, oh, just start talking to people, right? I think in general, it's hard for adults to make new friends, right? Like if you're not in school and you don't like the people at your work, like where do we even go? But we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. Do you want to talk specifically about isolation due to COVID? So like some of the things we mentioned are difficulties anyway for someone dealing with homelessness or coming out of incarceration. But specifically with COVID, like we are in unprecedented times. There is a weird tension in the air. There is this kind of crisis fatigue that everyone's dealing with. We don't half people are masked, half the people are not masked, and like that's creating a weird thing. And like the missing human interactions of either doing it through Zoom or doing interactions when you are masked, like all of these things are compiling. We still have very little physical contact, even though like we're out and about again. I still like, if somebody in the grocery store is within 3 feet of me, I'm kind of like, what are you doing? Right? My cat came to join us. We lost our like, we don't talk with strangers anymore, right? Like we used to maybe like strike up something here and there, but we just don't anymore. And it's interesting because I found that resilience, how resilient someone is very, very linked to human connection. The more connected somebody is to the people in their lives, the stronger their resilience is, which is really not great in COVID because the thing that's happening that we're having to be resilient against is also the same thing that's causing the lowered human connection. So we're kind of stuck in this vicious cycle that we have to help each other just as a whole get out of. Other things that we're seeing with COVID because of the isolation, increased substance and alcohol abuse, right? People are bored, people have anything else going on, people are feeling down. And it's getting a lot more likely that people are turning to substances. We're seeing increased domestic violence, we're seeing increased suicide rates, and on a less kind of scary sounding, but still really important is people aren't sleeping as well, just as a whole. Like I think like the lack of getting out, the lack of exercise, the lack of stretching our brains has resulted in like less sleep. So isolation is leading to all these negative consequences. And specifically, I want to talk about the older adults are being hit harder than the other generations. Just they pulled a meta study that I just found from 2020 that pulled from 41 other studies that were global that looked specifically at the impact on older adults versus like younger adults, and found that like they're experiencing anxiety, depression, poor sleep quality, and physical inactivity at a higher rates than the younger adults. And so like there's this cognitive decline that's happening. We're finding the older adults are at a higher risk for dementia than they ever used to be. So don't mean to like sound like doom and gloom here, but I think like understanding that like social isolation, it's like a second pandemic, right? Like we have this first like kind of primary thing going on, and we have this mental health crisis that's happening underneath the surface. The good news is I've come up with a list of ways to combat it, okay? So I'm not just leaving you on the doom and gloom. Before I get into that, are there any questions about how such social isolation is impacting, or maybe like if you don't understand like how one thing's leading to another, that I can help clarify?
Yeah.
I never know how long to wait after I ask a question like that.
Oh,
I don't want everyone to feel like,
Oh.
do you have a question, Jenny?
I noticed with my sister, because she is somewhat isolated. She's 7 years older than me, and we'll get on a conversation because she's not doing very much. And she asked me, "Do you go to work tomorrow?" Yes. And she'll repeat questions and then I'm a little irritated, like, how do I visit with her? And it's just, it's that interaction, because some people are not doing anything and you don't have a conversation to go on. And then you may not contact them so much because it's like, well, they don't have anything to say and there's nothing, conversation goes nowhere. So that's an isolation. It's that second pandemic with older people, like, oh, I didn't do very much today. And then you talk about how much you didn't do very much today. So yeah, it's not enlivening, Yeah.
And which leads to people calling each other less, which is leading to more of the isolation. Yeah, absolutely. Leslie, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have?
Yeah, I was wondering from Brenda's perspective, since you were an educator, how does that impact like students at school? I didn't initially think about the pandemic. I specifically was thinking like if you were in, I don't know, if you're in like public school or something like that, say IPS. And I know there's a certain population, they have some other needs that kind of surround where they need wraparound services. How would that impact like students, the isolation and things like that?
Yeah, well, they are having a hard time right now because of the isolation. They're not getting the resources and, having that day-to-day communication. So yeah, it's a little rough on them. And as you've heard in the news, the parents are having a very difficult time with them, keeping them busy, making sure they're staying up on things. But yes, it has a lot. If they're not surrounded, because they're very sociable. So if they're not surrounded by friends or have a means of really being with someone, that's going to affect them mentally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just not even learning, but playing. Playing is your social activity. It's how you play. I mean, children will make up rules and they'll make up their own games and the creativity. Yeah. And I'm not getting that. Yeah.
There's also a ton of research out there on this impact that's having to kids. For today, I'm going to focus on the adults just because your mentees will be adults, but like if you're interested in it, there really is a ton of research right now going on how this may have a long-term impacts on the kids. So, okay, so going into how to combat it, big picture here, focusing on purposeful living through social inclusion. Okay, what that means is quality over quantity, right? You're maybe not going to be able to go out as much, may not be able to be out for as long, there may not be as much going on, but being fully present when you do it, making it part of the routine, whether that's like a once a week coffee, even if that's the only thing that someone goes out and does, like making sure they don't miss it. Making phone calls that are a little bit more purposeful, having a plan. One of the things, my grandmother's 90, and really, really struggled during COVID. She was in assisted living. They wouldn't even let them leave their room for the first year. And my dad would call her almost every single day, and he'd come up with a different thing to argue about. He would literally just look up like controversial topics, lay it out for her, whatever side she picked, he picked the other side, just to kind of help her keep the cognitions going. So purposeful, right? Purposeful interactions. As things are starting to open up, right? Re-engaging with friends and family is one of the things to offer it as guidance. Is it, maybe before it was really hard to see people, but maybe now it's become a little bit less scary, or maybe people, I know right now it's 3 degrees out, but when the weather gets a little bit nicer, maybe planning ahead, hey, okay, we're not going to meet up right now, but like the first day that gets up over 40 degrees, like I want to meet up in the park, that sort of thing. Re-engaging into the community. Like Lynette had said earlier, like the loss of like that religious institution, a lot of people didn't go back after COVID hit, and like if they're feeling ready for it, to start re-engaging. Lynette, I saw you unmuted.
I had a question that I want to throw out to the group. How do you feel about, or how do you ask somebody if they've had the vaccine, or how do you feel if they ask you? Since we're supposed to be trying to meet with people, and some people may feel uncomfortable interacting with somebody that hasn't been vaccinated, or so I was just wondering if you all had an opinion on that.
I think I only asked, like, I guess she volunteered it, but to know that, look at Walgreens, they have this program in case you need to know, or, it's the Walgreens is around the corner, it's located here. So it's more of like offering the option without asking.
Yes, okay.
Well, I would say one thing is we don't have a policy, or we haven't established a policy. And I know Ed's worked with different mentors on different issues, but that's always, that even between mentor and mentee, between brothers and sisters, that can be a tough subject, right? Some of that is again, following good health practices, and paying attention to when rates are high like they are now. That certainly changes all of our behavior. And I'll let Ed talk a little bit about some of the other mentors, but following Marion County guidelines has been our process through this whole thing.
Yeah, I go to Recycle Force a lot, and there's a lot of guys and ladies over there that have not vaccinated, and they have a rule that you right now, particularly with Omicron and sort of the rise as Jerry alluded to, that everybody should be wearing masks, but they don't. And so I wear mine, and I'm not afraid to ask. I just am not, because it's my health, and I don't want to sort of get anything that I might be able to spread, right? But two, I went with a lady to one of our mentees' homes to sign them up and match them up, and we were both there with our masks on, and the lady, she put hers on, but I did ask her, when we sat down, we took them off. And then I asked her, I just said, listen, if you don't mind, we're vaccinated. I'll start out by saying that I'm vaccinated. How about you? No. Okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to wear my mask. And if she was just totally fine with it. To me, that's totally okay. I've not had any blowback from that. And I've used that quite a bit.
Yeah, I also start out with interactions with like first clients with saying like, I'm triple vaxxed, how about you? And then decide whether or not we're gonna wear masks from that. So yeah, I think that's, we're in a weird times. Right? You can even preface it with like, this feels weird to ask,
Yeah. And I have a friend that you can still get the cold. And if you're in an extended time in a close space, you can get a basic common cold, especially somebody who has children, and the children always bring the latest common cold variation home to the family. So it's even, some cultures wear a mask a lot if they're on a subway or something, it's, so it has may not have anything to do with COVID, just, or say that I'm going to be around some elderly people, I need to be careful. I don't know. Make up a story.
Has anybody had any challenges with,
Huh?
has anybody else had any challenges with that, where there's
No.
been confrontation or anything towards that end? If not, again, I've not experienced it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna jump back into just some other ways to start getting reconnected. Volunteering is a great way. It's also a good resume builder for people who may have been out of the workforce for a long time and don't feel ready to jump into a full job. Again, these things are all assuming that someone feels comfortable to start interacting again, which is maybe something to assess first. How comfortable do you feel with being out in the community? Certainly when the weather gets better, this conversation becomes easier because there's tons of free things to do that are out and about, the fairs, the festivals, the farmers markets. There are more events and things like that. As COVID lifts, like more resources will be put back in place. Engaging in a hobby is a good way. Again, purposeful living, especially if they're going to share it, right? Like it's okay if it's a solo hobby, someone wants to paint on their own time, garden on their own time, but share it with somebody. Again, to have that extra social connection. So the solo activity then becomes something that still gives them a sense of identity, right? Utilizing video chats when possible. Again, remembering that loneliness isn't necessarily a lack of physical surroundness, but the lack of a sense of connecting. So if somebody can get a connection through a video chat, it's certainly better than nothing. I know the libraries are open back up again. And so if somebody doesn't have their own access, working with the libraries to go and use their rooms, their cameras, they have that stuff available. Some other resources, there's a thing called Senior Companions, which matches volunteers to older adults. People who want to go back to school or just like take a class, like an art class or something like that. Money is an issue there, depending on where somebody's at. But if money's not an issue, it's a great way to meet people. One of the best things you can do for mentees who are not ready to like start reconnecting with the communities and are feeling the effects of the social isolation is help them get connected with mental health services. People can do that through their insurance, Google search, 211 gives that information. The nice thing is almost every mental health service is still using telehealth as an option. A lot of us have switched to doing in person for the clients who want to, but pretty much everyone across the board, insurances are still covering telehealth, and looks like they probably will for the foreseeable future. Okay. One of the best things is connecting with you guys, right? Like if you have a weekly or bi-weekly phone call meeting set up with your mentee, like that is like the social connectedness. Somebody cares what I'm doing. Somebody wants to hear about my life. Somebody's interested in what positive changes I've made. No one size fits all. So just always listening first. And then I want to that's pretty much it for my information, but I want to open up a conversation of like, how do you reach that conversation? How do you talk to your mentee about whether or not they're experiencing social isolation and having negative effects from it?
Mm. Mm.
I'll ask it again in case anyone was phasing out while I was asking the question. So how do you breach the conversation? Like, how do you find out if your mentee is dealing with social isolation and if they want help for feeling more connected? How do you breach that?
I think mine is has had burned by other people she trusted, and it became a situation that wasn't optimal for a friendship. Or So it's, like she learned her lesson and will not strike up new friendships and make friends so easily or quickly. So it's just like to find that place where they go. I mean, a lot of us go to a faith community and find friends, make friends there, at least have acquaintances and get together and be with somebody for a few minutes a week. But yeah, so.
Other ideas? How do you start the conversation? Like, what do you guys think of just saying like, oh, go ahead, Jeriel.
I was gonna say, obviously, it's a tough thing to bring up because no one has necessarily feels real comfortable. But I do think it can make an observation. Boy, you've been home alone because it's been hard to get out. How are you feeling? And with an open-ended question, because you seem really lonely, or does not seem to be the question to ask, right? But it's tough to ask someone about tough emotions, because I do think loneliness and isolation is a tough thing to experience.
How do you guys feel about saying something like, we're in weird times. I heard that like everyone's dealing with loneliness. Have you been dealing with it? How does that feel to you guys? Sorry, Brenda, if you wanted to share.
I just simply began it with, how are you doing, whatever, and tell me how things are going with you. How are things going with your family? And then I kind of build on what we talked about previously. Her church, my mentee is very involved in her church. She's trying to start a business, so I asked her about that. And her family, she's very active with her family. So I asked her specific questions about that and asked her to, explain things to me or let me know how it's going, just to break the ice somewhat. So my mentee, she's around, quite a few people. And like I said, she's very sociable. So that's how I do. Howard, tell me how things are going, and just doing the, maybe sometimes just be specific about it.
I like that.
I think along the lines of what Brenda said too, is I think you can start it by saying, what are some things that you have had to give up or that have changed for you? And then, once they if they have a list of things, then go through each one. How has it affected you? What's changed because of that? And how are you feeling? And because then you've given them the opportunity to say how they're feeling, and hopefully they're sharing. Right. And then you can what are some things we can do to, bridge that gap that was created by this? I think that would be a kind of a good way to approach it as well.
I want to make sure you guys have time to talk about your specific mentee concerns, but are there any kind of lasting questions? Okay. All right. Well, then thank you for letting me share. I'm gonna step out so you guys can talk about your mentees and what questions you have and stuff. But I appreciate you, and it was nice to connect even through a video chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Rachel.
you.
You're always wonderful to listen to. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Ed, maybe you can stop. I think you started the recording, so we'll stop the recording, and Ed's going to lead this portion too about the specific needs once we